the StreamYard is going to play nice with us today. So if you guys would repost the space out to everyone, and hopefully Trump Frog comes in today so I can apologize for standing him up last night. Holy crap. Um,
We fed in a little bit and actually had a really good discussion about all sorts of things going on. And
well, there's no end of topics to talk about, that's for sure.
Right. And I did pass along the message that you had a minor emergency or minor major emergency.
It was just really a minor thing, but of course, you know, they didn't know what to do. So and I'm still puzzled by it. I don't know, I have never seen the and just so everybody knows what we're talking about, my daughter, who just had the my grandbaby, had the umbilical cord fall off prematurely. And I just have never seen that happen. So, got it all taken care of. Baby's doing awesome. Yeah. So, as soon as we get off of here, I will be going over there to give them a couple hours break, and spending a little grandma time. Okay. So, I don't know how many of you know anything about Liberia. So we're going to do a little history, and we start off with our map as we usually do. When you pull up, and I've got to tell you, Liberia, we did probably several months ago talk a little bit about Liberia, just not a deep dive into it, because it has one of the most fascinating, crazy histories if you don't know anything about it. So Liberia, if you go, it's on the furthest western side of Africa up. So like we talked about Africa looking like the peninsula of Florida, Liberia is around the Pensacola area. If you were comparing it to Florida, it is, as you go up the leg of Africa, and then it jets over to the west, and then it starts back up north. Just as you make the curve north, Liberia is on the coast there. And Sierra Leone is the next country up. And Guinea kind of is the next country up, but it loops back around the eastern side of Sierra Leone and becomes Liberia's northern border. And the Ivory Coast is to its east. So Monrovia is the capital. Now, yeah, there you go. So you see it's the Pensacola of Florida. Thank you for putting that up there, Bridget. Paints that picture perfectly. So here's what's the most fascinating thing to me about Liberia. If you were to look at a map in the 1700s of the continent of Africa, you're not going to find it. It is another one of those completely made up countries, but it didn't appear after World War II. It appeared in the 1800s, and it was created by the United States as a colony. Now, I don't remember, and again, I was at public school educated, I don't remember ever being told that we had an actual colony. I specifically don't remember being told we had a colony in Africa. And I really don't remember anything about being told that we set this colony up to repatriate African Americans, African that had been brought to America that wanted to go back to Africa, but didn't necessarily know what country. So we weren't just repatriating African descendants back to their home countries in Africa. We specifically went over there and carved out a country called and gave it a name, Liberia, and said any freed Black American that wanted to go back, and we're talking like in the 1820s, that wanted to go back to Africa could do so in this dedicated colony called Liberia. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest bottom line up front, because it's the crazy part that if you are descendant of Africa and you are involuntarily brought to America as a slave, and you are subsequently freed, to me, you would think that whether you stay in America or whether you go to Africa, as part of this colony build that we did here, which of course we had to steal somebody's land in order to do it. You would think that you would prize freedom above everything else, wouldn't you? If you have actually known slavery and been a slave, that if you were given an entire country to set up and create, the last thing that you would have there is slavery, right? You'd be wrong. Because what actually happened is the people that left America and went over there were much better educated in most cases than indigenous people that were there or came there from the surrounding area. And as a result of that, they very much had a caste system very similar to India, with all of the negative aspects of that caste system. They had the what they basically referred to as the America Africa people, and then they had the African people. In just to give you a little bit of specifics, in 1816, Liberia was formed, and it was called American Colonialization Society, ACS, in the United States. And this American Colonialization Society went looking for a place to repatriate Black Americans and formerly enslaved people back to Africa. And that particular area of Africa is called the Grain Coast, because they harvest a lot of grains, rice, and that type of thing. And in July 26th, 1847, so about 30 years later, they declared their independence from America and said, we're not your colony anymore. Well, America said, screw you. You're still our colony, and we're not going to recognize the fact that you're not. So they continued to treat them as a colony. And no one else basically recognized Liberia as a free state, because you didn't dare do that. Because then America would have been reciprocated and not recognized the colonies of the Europeans. So Liberia remained officially internationally a colony until 1862, after the Civil War. And then it was a little hard to say, yeah, we're going to free all of the slaves in the United States and keep a colony of basically slaves in Africa under the tutelage of former Americans that also happened to be Black, because by that time the caste system had been fully developed, and you had Black former American slaves enslaving the indigenous population of Africa to work for them in basically a India style caste system. So I found that like just absolutely crazy. So all of the settlers and their descendants became known as Americo-Liberians. It's like we say African Americans, they're called Americo-Liberians. Those people are like the elite within Liberia. They are Black, but they are not indigenous. They are not indigenous not only to Liberia, but a lot of them were actually born in America and went over there in this repatriation type effort. In 1931, the International Commission revealed that several prominent Americo-Liberians had enslaved indigenous people. The Americo-Liberians constituted less than 2% of the Liberian population, but in the 19th and 20th century, they made up 100% of the voters because they were landowners. For over 100 years, from its formation in 1860s, like being separately recognized as a country and not a colony, until 1980, that's like in our lifetime, the Americo-Liberian True Whig Party dominated Liberian politics in what was essentially a minority-ruled one-party state, like a dictatorship. Though they were Black, the Americo-Liberians created a cultural divide. From the day they arrived, they set about establishing an American rather than an African culture. They spoke English, they dressed like Americans, they built Southern-style plantation homes, they ate American foods, they were Christians, and lived in monogamous relationships, which was not necessarily the tradition there. They became a republic, other than the fact that it was a dictatorship, as far as Congress and stuff like that. But they did have people that stayed in office. They didn't have term limits, like in a gross way. They didn't have term limits. So obviously the whole reason we're talking about this is because they have had coups as a result of and very much into the bring up my other article here. Hold on just a second. Because it gets pretty dang crazy here. Oh, shoot. What happened to I got my map open. I got all these things open. So it's going to take me just a second. To get my other article up here. Well, oh, here it is. Okay. So this article is written on a website called Voices for Freedom and Justice. And it does a very good job of, it doesn't have an author though listed. Oh, there it is. Brooks Marman. It was written in 2017. And I'm just going to read you kind of the highlights here. The U.S. was deeply involved in the overthrow and assassination of the Liberian President William Tolbert. That led to a 14-year civil war in which as many as 250,000 Liberians perished. Subsequently, America was also implicated in the removal from power of 2 other Liberian presidents. The truth of this extensive meddling is important for genuine reconciliation among Liberians. You are, let's see, 35 years later, Richard Tolbert vividly recalls the words that were barked at him after armed soldiers raided his office at the Mesorado Group, which was his company. And Richard is the brother of William, who was the president. So they are very wealthy and owned a large corporation there. Liberia's largest and most successful private enterprise was this company that was owned by the brother of the president. International syndicate going on. Richard had just come out of hiding after receiving assurances that he would not be subject to such treatment. Several weeks earlier, his uncle, Richard is the son of the brother. Sorry, it's his nephew. William Tolbert had been murdered in a bloody coup that ended 150 years of political domination by the nation's American descendant settler elites. And I want to send this link, Bridget, I'm just going to text it to you, of the article that I was just reading, because it's, I want people to see the pictures in this article. We can cut and paste a couple of them, because you have to get in your brain what these people look like. It's important because you're going to see in this article, the very first picture that you see is a guy by the name of Charles King, who was the 17th president of Liberia from 1920 to 30. And he's in a very nice dress or suit. His wife is in a beautiful dress, a mink hanging around her neck. All of the women all have mink stoles on. The little kid has like this sailor outfit on. There's a guy, like a servant, who's white, that has a tuxedo on in the background. The gentlemen are all dressed in these military high boot uniforms. And there's a couple of white people in the picture, but the majority of all of the leadership over there were all Black. And they had white people from European descent that actually were working for them. And they led a very elite life, and they were called True Whig Party. That was the name of their political party. And again, it was the only political party. These people were allowed to vote because no one else owns land. And that was the determinant of whether or not you got to vote. And that's how they maintained power for so long. So all of that stuff is very important to get in your brain on the caste system that had been created in Liberia, and how easy it was when the CIA decided that they wanted to control Liberia to create havoc there, because the makings of the cultural divide, which is where they hammer every time, whether it's race or religion or whatever, there's going to be a divide, and they're going to use it. And in most cases, they're really good at creating it, even if it doesn't exist. But in this case, the divide was already there because you had the haves and the have-nots built in by a self-inflicted caste society. Because these people, when they came over there from America, didn't have to create a country that had a caste system. They could have recognized their fellow human beings for fellow human beings, like equals. but they chose not to. Which I just find, when you look at humanity, I just find that interesting, that people who have experienced slavery would turn around and institute their own form of slavery. Because I look, and I know this is not in any way comparison to that, but I look at my experience when I enlisted in the Air Force, and if there is ever a caste system developed, it's definitely the enlisted and officer corps in the military. You know, and rightfully so. It's a hierarchy, everything. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing from a discipline, mission, all of that stuff. You have to have that separation, but it would be the equivalent. And I've seen the people that do this, so trust me. I was just as fascinated by that as I am by this. When you are enlisted and you get to become an officer, however that road ends up being, because there's different avenues to get there, there are a distinct separation between some officers who turn their back on enlisted and treat them awfully because they were able to elevate themselves out of that population. And then there are others that spend their entire career looking out for the enlisted corps that they came from. And there's a few others that never actually make that transition and still kind of get way too friendly with the enlisted people. And you have to walk a thin line, because you can't be one of them anymore, but you also can't be above them. There is a middle ground, and it's easily identified for those who choose to walk down that middle ground. And so I've seen this in practice, and when I see it in the real world, I'm still fascinated by it, which is why I could read everything that was ever written about Liberia and the nuances on how this whole thing unfolded. So we're going to carry on a little bit more about this. All right. So in the early morning of April 1980, as the president prepared to go to sleep, a small group of enlisted soldiers shot their way into the presidential suite on the 8th floor of the executive mansion and executed the commander-in-chief, the president. At least 6 of the attackers had been trained by the U.S. military. What's that tell you? Operation Gladio. But I want you to take, because I obviously have been military, this is a paragraph, and then they go on, and I'll go on in a minute, but I do want to highlight something because this is very important. A small group of enlisted soldiers shot their way into a presidential suite on the 8th floor of the presidential mansion. There's almost no way that could ever happen in real life, unless there's insiders involved in this coup. Every one of those floors is going to have security. And there's no way that if you breach the bottom floor, you're ever going to make it into the presidential suite. No way. There's helicopter pads, there's all kinds of stuff. So there's no way this actually just happened unless there's CIA involvement. Higher ups, both in the military and in the government, involved in this. So several days later, Richard watched in horror as his father, Frank, who was the president of the Senate, was executed on live TV. They had taken several Liberian heads of state in different occupations, but government employees, out to a beach and shot them live on television. 36 years later, the families of the Americo-Liberian elite continue to grapple with these events. Indicative of the complex historical relationship between U.S. and Liberia, their surviving family members entertain the possibility that the coup was enabled by basically the CIA. In her autobiography, President Tolbert's widow, Victoria, noted that her husband's killers exclaimed that they would receive 25,000 bounty for their handiwork. Her youngest son, William Tolbert III, said that the successor government formed by his father's killers received more aid in just 5 years than the country had received in its entire history, which at that point was like, I mean, they started in like in 1820. So if you think about that, you know, that's 160 years worth of aid. And the US government, USAID and CIA had given the new coup government more aid in those few years than they had in the entire history. So again, another indication that it was CIA. Okay. The author said that he had spoke to members of the Tolbert family and to many former government officials. And they said that they were haunted by the idea that the U.S. actions led to the demise of Tolbert and gave way to a 14-year civil war where over 250,000 Liberians died. And that's just in that 14-year period because they had a couple other coups. We remind governments of our desire to bring closure to these tragic events in 1980. Our desire should be linked to the commitment to assist us in those goals. The closest that Liberia has come to closure was in 2009, a release of a final report on the nation's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Most international media centered around the commission's recommendation that the sitting president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, be barred from office for 30 years. The report's allegation that during the Tolbert era, both the CIA and the Pentagon was now prospecting for leadership change in Liberia was largely overlooked. Operation Gladio. Likewise, in a book called Beneath the Cold War, The Death of a Nation, a highly critical book on U.S. policy towards Liberia by the husband and wife team of Sadie and Leonard Deschild, mid-level operatives in Tolbert's true Whig party, has gone unnoticed outside of the Liberian circles. Tolbert III and other family members of those who lost loved ones in the coup have established an April 22nd memorial group to push for further disclosure, although the activities are primarily like annual meetings. Liberia was one of the few African nations without a European colonial history, because it had an American one. The West African nation was settled throughout the 19th century by Black Americans with the support of an under-resourced white American-led resettlement organization, the American Colonialization Society. The Americo-Liberian settlers alternately fought and assimilated with the indigenous Africans. They forged an uneasy arrangement that resulted in what nominally was called the First African Republic in 1847 after a quarter of a century of the ACS being in charge of it. Richard praises the efforts of his uncle to help Liberia emerge from its historical burden. William genuinely tried to reform the Americo-Liberian class. He was part of that class, and that's what he paid the price for. Throughout the 1970s, Tolbert struggled to balance a reform agenda and international leadership aspirations against pressure from the governing True Whig Party, and emboldened opposition and the U.S. Tolbert assumed office in 1971 after 19 years as the vice president. He was displeased by the extent of support traditionally offered by the U.S. He actually had asked them for more support, and they turned him down, only to give the guy that kills him all of the money. In 1973, he severed relations with Israel. Where's Liza? Richard believes that this was the gravest foreign policy mistake that he made that led to his uncle's demise. Liberia also established relations with a number of America Cold War enemies like Libya and the USSR. Not because he was communist, because he definitely was not. But he did want, because the US had basically began cutting him off, because he was trying to merge the gray line or the black and white line of the caste system, and he was trying to promote education and do all of that stuff. That was not wanted. And when the US basically, same stories, began reducing aid, he started looking for help elsewhere. And of course, you're not allowed to talk to Libya or the Soviet Union. So he got whacked for that too. As Tolbert consolidated his authority, he not only engaged in dialogue that displeased the US, but he pursued policies that undermined the ability of American companies, the international syndicate, to exploit Liberian resources. Stephen Tolbert was the president's University of Michigan educated minister of finance and founder of the Mercerado Group. He maintained a vacation home in DC and initiated the Americans considerable and irritated the Americans considerably more than his brother, who was the president. He went after a number of US companies operating in Liberia, most notable Firestone. Remember, we talked about them a little bit yesterday. Richard Tolbert was then a law student at Columbia, and he sat in on negotiations. He remembers saying that Stephen saw just how they were screwing us. He tightened up all the loopholes, but he did it in a not nice manner. In April 1975, Stephen Tolbert died in a mysterious plane crash after getting more out of Firestone than what they had been willing to give. The Nigerian press suggested that the CIA had tinkered with the plane. And weirdly enough, no one was able to find the engine that had malfunctioned ever. It simply disappeared. So they were never able to find out that the CIA messed with the engine that made the plane crash. Weird. By the mid 1970s, domestic political opposition to the Tolbert government and 150 years of settler rule was coalescing. The Progressive Alliance, coalescing right around the CIA. The Progressive Alliance of Liberia was formed in New Jersey. I wonder if that's by the same place the Ukrainian Nazis lived in New Jersey. In 1974, by the Liberians studying in the US, it was led by a man by the name of G. Bacchus Matthews. He had close ties to the Tolbert family. However, he bore a grudge against the president due to his dismissal from the Liberian consulate in New York because he was embezzling money. Marcus Dahn, D-A-H-N, was a senior member of the PAL, the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, who graduated from the University of Akron, right down the road from Goodyear. That's weird. He notes that it has American roots, the Progressive Alliance for Liberia. And remember how we've this again is a pattern. We've said many times that, remember, was it Kurdistan? No. They're one of the made up countries. The guy went and took leadership of the country in a ceremony in DC and went to his house in Virginia. A lot of these organizations that the CIA uses are these like under the Chamber of Commerce kind of groups that have names like the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, but they're founded in the United States, like with US AID money. And then they go over to the country and are the ones that get the boots on the grounds to create the havoc or pay off the enlisted guys to run up the stairs and kill the president. Funny how that works. So we call the Progressive Alliance of Liberia the product of the Peace Corps. They did such a good job for us when they were in high school. He's saying that facetiously. The homegrown campaign, the movement for justice in Africa, led by a University of Nebraska educated guy whose name is Toba Na Tipoteh, Tipoteh. That organization also is Moja, also was set up at exactly the same time, kind of like they're planning something. Moja indoctrinated a number of members of the armed forces of Liberia in its Pan-African ideology, including the future coup leader Samuel Doe, D-O-E. The young soldiers attended night classes at Moja's Marcus Garvey School. Winston believes that both groups were supported by the CIA. Tipoteh would not confirm this, but he does claim that Matthews, now deceased, was a paid agent of the CIA of $25,000 a month. So, CIA assets setting up organizations to go to Liberia, create havoc, and coup the government. Nothing to see here. In the late 1970s, President Tolbert again angered the U.S. by refusing around-the-clock access to bunkering facilities at Liberia's international airport. Richard says his uncle informed the Americans that they could only gain access on a 24-hour basis over his dead body. So all they did was accommodate him. He adds that this was the self-fulfilling prophecy of his uncle's death, which happened soon after this. What they wanted the use of this aircraft for was because the United States and the CIA was shipping arms through Liberia, like they were, and if you go and you look at where Angola is on down the coast, they were shipping arms. They wanted to ship arms through Liberia into the United Rebels of Angola. That's what all of this is leading up to. 2 months later, following a mysterious late night PAL demonstration at the executive mansion, the government swiftly retaliated. Tolbert accused Matthews and his associates of masterminding a coup in a legislative address. Intelligence reports revealed that the Progressive People's Party had designed a plan to execute an armed insurrection with intent to overthrow the government. Despite being on heightened alert, Tolbert was massacred just 1 month later. See, that's why you know something's going on about the whole, we're going to go walk up all of these steps or take elevators up to the top floor and assassinate the president. Yeah, that didn't happen like that. Tolbert says, I can't say for sure. I would love to know. I hope that one day it will be revealed. It was very, Liberia did not have the trained experts who could overpower forces all the way up from the ground floor to the 8th floor. There is no question the CIA supported the opposition to Tolbert. As to, let's see, James Dennis echoes this assessment. Ask if the 17 soldiers were capable, 17 soldiers, were capable of carrying out the coup alone. He forcibly responds, no way. He added that his brother's secure phone line at the foreign ministry had been cut, something he doesn't think any of those low-ranking soldiers would have even knew how to do. Dennis's suspicions were also aroused by a neighbor, the U.S. Embassy employee, who Dennis said was a CIA agent, who reported at around 2 a.m. that the coup was successful. How do you even know what was going on? To Dennis, this indicated that the U.S. Embassy was in close contact with the assault. Tolbert III notes that Samuel Doe, the figurehead of the coup, was sleeping on the grounds of the executive mansion while the assault unfolded. If President Doe did not kill Tolbert, who did? Because actually, the way it comes off in most media, if you go back and you read the articles, they say that the Doe guy is the one that actually went up with the group and killed him. Tipite claims that an American was in the mansion yard as the coup was unfolding, providing one possible theory. Emmanuel Bollier, Doe's Minister of Information, observes that the local rumor mill alleges that a gravely wounded Caucasian in military fatigues was seen outside the executive mansion during the coup. Elwood Dunn, a member of Toll's cabinet, embarked on a noted career in academia in the U.S. following the coup. He has been trying to determine if the U.S. played a role in Tolbert's ouster. He has not found a paper trail, but he says the U.S.-Liberia relationship was severely strained and believes the U.S. found a way to remove Tolbert. Following the coup, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. In April, later in April, because this happened in April, tied to poles with their backs to the beach, 13 officials of the Tolbert government, including his brother, were executed. Tolbert's eldest son was seized from the French embassy and disappeared several months later. Other Americo-Liberians were imprisoned for up to 2 years. William Jarboe, the U.S.-trained ranger whose close ties to the U.S. military mission in Liberia, was shot down by Doe's loyalists while trying to escape the country a few weeks later. In a twist of event, that was not adequately explained. Now, let me tell you what I think, based on a whole other bunch of articles that I've read. I believe that this William Jarboe guy was the guy that actually helped them pull off the coup, and then they killed him when he was basically trying to leave the country, so that he couldn't talk and implicate anybody else. In 1982, and that just comes from a whole bunch of articles that I've read, because it's a totally strange, crazy story. In 1982, Doe was warmly welcomed by President Reagan. Doe, the killer, right? All of the newspapers has said this is the guy that killed the democratically elected president. He was warmly welcomed by President Reagan at the White House around the same time that Tolbert III was released from prison. Let's see. Just days before he arrived in D.C., Doe presided over the execution of 5 of his comrades who had played a role in the coup. Must not have wanted them to talk either. The Washington Post reported that they had criticized what they perceived as Doe's government, quote unquote, errand boy relationship with the U.S. In other words, he was a CIA stooge. Doe was expected to make way for a civilian government in 1985, but rigged elections that year with U.S. acquiescence. His inability to step aside prompted an almost immediate unsuccessful coup attempt from one of his fellow 1980 conspirators. The assault was led by Thomas Quinwonka. That's Quiwonka, who lived in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. after he fell out with Doe, because that's where you go. Doe and most of his fellow coup makers were dead by the early years of the Liberian Civil War, which broke out in 1989. However, at least one survivor, Jeffrey Gabatu, now lives in the United States. America's ties to Liberian conflict are numerous. Prince Johnson, a sitting Liberian senator who presided over Doe's videotape execution in 1990, so they murdered him, attempted to reach the U.S. Embassy to obtain instructions on how to handle his captive. Liberians hope the final chapter in their crisis closed in 2006 when George Bush backtracked on his promise not to pursue the extradition of Liberian Prince Charles Taylor, Liberian President Charles Taylor, whose departure to Nigeria finally ended the war in 2003. Amidst contemporary violence in Burundi and the Congo as leaders seek to extend their rule, Richard takes pride in the way his uncle managed opposition. The Tolbert family does not have blood on our hands. The Tolberts can go anywhere in Africa and hold up our head. Richard's words stand in stark contrast not only to the African leaders who have relied on nefarious means to stay in power, but also the global superpowers having put them in power to begin with. While the former American ambassador, Deborah Malac, M-A-L-A-C, denied that the U.S. makes secret handshakes with Liberian leaders, liar, the historical record in Liberia and elsewhere leads Africans to believe otherwise. It has been widely alleged that the CIA supported regime change in nations like Ghana and the Congo. And other people have written about U.S. covert and overt operations, not just in Liberia, but all over the continent of Africa, to include Charles Taylor. The early meddling established a precedence. The Liberians who attributed the eruption in violence in their country to a history of American initiatives characterized by paternalism or colonialism at best. And let's see. I wanted to go into the whole Firestone. There's an article, and I'm going to I'm going to copy it. I'm not going to read this whole article. We won't have time. But this one is incredibly important because this one actually tells the story of what Goodyear did, because it's hideous. When the whole coup happened, let me get back to it, with Taylor, and let's see. Yeah, Charles Taylor is a guy who basically comes to power. He in another coup. He was also educated in the United States, weirdly enough. Like, again, I have come to the conclusion that most of these international exchanges is CIA recruitment opportunities to bring them to our universities. That program needs to stop. It needs to go away immediately, because they groom them while they're here to go back and do their missions. And so this Taylor guy basically incrementally takes over he's the one that coups the Doe guy. He begins it in his coup in December 1989. And this leads to a massive civil war. And basically, he comes up to what is the Firestone Plantation, which is this huge, big, like hundreds of thousands of acres of rubber trees. And they basically employ the indigenous people as slaves there. And they have the upper crust Liberians as kind of like the plantation overseers in all the cottages around the main place where the Goodyear executives live. And so they evacuate all of the Goodyear executives and they basically leave everybody else there to be massacred. And it's just a hideous story. But it's important to understand what these U.S. companies do. And while they are there, the basically enslavement of the population for pennies and the way in which they discipline the people when they don't meet their quotas It is like literally a modern day slave plantation. And then if the CIA comes in, and I'm going to tell you why the CIA wanted this, in addition to the previous reason to run flights into Angola for arms trafficking, because that's exactly what the CIA was doing. They also are, well, let me tell you what they're doing it for now. They are, I've noticed this. This is now the fourth country, and I didn't see the pattern until this one. The CIA has decided they're putting drone bases all over Africa. And the way they did it, like in Niger, the way they did it was they're going to put a drone base there, and it's a non-lethal drone base. It's just for observation, right? Now, think about this from a military perspective. If you're stealing resources, if your companies like the diamond guy that we talked about, whose name's going to escape me, that was in the Congo stealing all of the diamonds, and the whole WWF, if you're going to have terrorist training bases, you have to be able to control the airspace. Okay. If you have possession of national forestry, you can't have people flying over it. You have to have control because you are training terrorists there. You are stealing resources. Well, initially, to get your foot in the door, you tell all of these African countries that you're going to have, because of the terrorist that the CIA created and infiltrated into Africa under the guise of ISIS or whatever. So they imported the terrorists, they trained and imported them. Then they used the trained imported terrorists as a reason why they have to have the observation drones to be able to track them. And they get just enough special forces in there to be bait for the ISIS people that the CIA train to kill them. And then, like in Niger, in the Tonga Tonga episode, where the special forces guy says, hey, this mission you sent me on, the local commander, we should not be doing this. It's too risky. His lieutenant colonel commander and colonel commander above him tell the captain, shut the fuck up and do it anyway. 4 of his guys gets killed, U.S. servicemen. And do you know what the next step for us was? Oh my God, Niger, we need weaponized drones so this doesn't happen. So they sacrificed 4 U.S. special forces to be able to upgrade from the unweaponized drones that are just there to track these ISIS guys that we inserted back here. And then we'll sacrifice a few of our guys in the stupidest thing that could have ever been set up. No one would have sent anybody on the mission. And when the 4 of them get killed, they then use that as the crisis to say, oh my God, we've got to have weapons on these drones. If we'd have just had weapons on these drones, we could have saved their lives. And this isn't the first, like I said, they're doing this in Liberia. They're doing this in Niger. They're doing this all over Africa. So now think about this from an overall Gladio perspective. If you have unmanned drones, both from a observation standpoint and the weaponization of them, you control every fucking thing in Africa, everything. All of the illegal trade routes, because if anybody comes in and cuts in on you, you drone them. Who would know you're in the middle of Africa? Who's going to get told? You could take out anybody. You watch everybody. Now, take all of that information and match that information to what I told you about Pine Gap in Australia. And what is Pine Gap in Australia? The Global Satellite Positioning Control Center that basically controls all of the satellites in the southern hemisphere of the globe. Do you see how all of that fits together? That's crazy. So they have to have Pine Gap. And so when the Prime Minister of Australia was kicking the United States out of Pine Gap and threatened to close it down, they cooed him too. This is all coordinated and all a big effort to control all of the resources inside of Africa. And if you refuse to play, they will kill you. So that's that. Oh, dang. That was good. That's right at 1 hour. Go ahead, Bridget.
Just wanted to throw this in there because I came across it. The Firestone Fire and Rubber Company has operated the world's largest rubber plantation in the world in Harpo, Liberia for over 80 years. Firestone signed a concession agreement with the government of Liberia, who leased 1 million acres of land in 1926 for 6 cents per acre for a period of 99 years. They've been, it's just Firestone workers, and it talks about them using small children, forced to carry 2 70-pound buckets of rubber on their shoulder for miles.
So, yeah, let me explain, because in the one article that I sent you, I just sent you an archive one that I want you to post as well. But the one that I sent, that's a story of the actual second coup with Firestone. The interesting thing, I didn't know this about how you manufacture rubber. Basically, you have, and I mean, they had hundreds of millions of acres of rubber trees in Liberia. And it's interesting that you would almost conclude, based on the timing, that they set up Liberia just for them, you know what I mean? And not as an actual resettlement colony. Hey, let me figure out where I could best locate something, and I could call it a repatriation thing for freed Black people. But really, I'm just doing it to steal resources, kind of thing, because that's the way they think. So, but setting that aside, they planted this entire, like, ginormous plantation with rubber trees. And rubber trees, basically, there is a particular way with a very sharp knife you score the tree, like a sap maple tree to get maple syrup. You score it and you put a bucket on it, and it weeps down into the bucket, and the rubber does. And then you take that rubber in these little buckets and you dump them into big buckets. And then they were having the little kids run them little buckets back and forth to the big buckets. And then the big buckets, they did like the Oriental with the bar across their shoulder. And they had them 2 big ones on the end of each one of those, that stick on your shoulders. And they carried them miles they had to walk. And they eventually upgraded into vehicles and stuff like that. But the labor was cheap. So they didn't spend a lot of labor on vehicles because they just made people walk.
Just incredible. I mean, like you said, and you were talking about the people living in these tiny little shacks that had not been renovated since the 1920s. Meanwhile, the Firestone managers have huge houses with all the modern conveniences and even a golf course.
A 9-hole golf course. Yep.
Unreal. Unreal.
Yeah, it is unreal. So does anybody have any questions? Anybody want a mic? Just request a mic and come on up. And I see Zama. I know Zama's going to want to say something. Anybody else have any comments? Come on up and talk to us.
Hi, Karen. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for a fantastic space again. Really loving this. Great stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a kind of strange, maybe sidebar to Gladio in Liberia, which is, I know Gladio has, we talk a lot about false flags, but I'm wondering if you've ever come across in your research on Liberia of a thing called flags of convenience.
I did not.
So it's an interesting kind of bit of trivia, but I think it's kind of connected. If you go to any seaport in America or the world, that is, and look at the flags flying from the back of any of the massive tankers,
right,
or giant ships or containers, you'll see something that looks like an American flag, but it isn't quite. It's got one star in the blue field, and it's the Liberian flag, funny enough. And so it's interesting because Liberia is basically the largest purveyor, or you want to call it, of something called flags of convenience, right?
No shit.
Yeah.
I mean, I know what it is, but I didn't know that Liberia was one of the biggest ones.
Yeah, by a milestone, by the way. I think the second one is Panama, and then you have Marshall Islands and a few other tiny micronations, right? And to kind of give a background on that, for centuries, ships used to, naturally fly under the flag of their home country, or usually the home country of the ship owner, and this meant that they had to follow, by law, the laws of that country,
right?
Even if they were half a world away. But then what happened was that basically, merchant ships also by international law have to be registered by under a country. But mainly after World War II, though this was happening under the Prohibition, a lot of this happened under Prohibition, but World War II in the 1950s, a lot of countries started to basically welcome other ships or ship owners to register as a means of saying, hey, look, we have different laws. You can fly our flag. We're cheaper. We require less regulation. And look, it's really easy to register. So that's kind of what, in summary, the flag of convenience is. And it's quite a normal practice. Like, it does happen quite a lot. And for pretty normal reasons, right? So I think sometimes, like, you can literally register a ship online nowadays. But that aside, one of the things convenience is also flags of convenience of this sort of practice is that you don't have to necessarily pay your sailors as much. You can require them to work longer hours. You can also carry illicit goods or people, for example, or those sort of things and practices can be certainly overlooked. And this was definitely one of the things that Liberia offered. They didn't come up with this idea themselves. It actually, the Liberian flag of convenience comes down to an American guy called Edward I can't even say his name.
Stettinius.
Yep, Stettinius Jr.
Yes.
And now he is a very interesting, colorful character because he basically came up with this whole thing. He's an American businessman, served as U.S. Secretary of State under FDR and Truman in 44 to 45.
And what's that tell you?
Right. First U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. It was just formed in 1946. Big elite family, comes from sort of Staten Island, but I think mainly Virginia landowners. Finished basically, graduate university, having taken no courses, catapulted straight into big industry. I think American Steel during all of that sort of Depression time. Member of secret society, the Seven Secret Society. That's an interesting little.
Oh, and let me tell you what that is,
hole.
because we've come across that multiple times.
Go ahead. Please tell more about that.
Well, the only way you know that they're a part of that secret society is they have a wreath laid on their grave of black magnolias. No one knows anything about who's a member of it. There's lots of innuendos about the actual because they have all kinds. They use the number 7 all of the time in various different ways. Like when they leave donations at universities, it's never like 1 million. It's always like 777,000. Blah blah blah. So afterwards, several of the people. And do you know who one of the people that was a member? Frank Wisner, who is like the guy for the CIA.
No way.
Yes, Frank Wisner. That's how I first found out about it.
That's crazy.
Yeah, Frank Wisner worked for this guy, actually, at the Secretary of State. He was the policy branch at the Secretary of State, and his entire office, when they created the CIA, picked up out of the State Department and moved over to the CIA with Frank in charge of it.
That's fascinating. I mean, I've never heard of these guys before. This secret society. Obviously, there's a whole world of them looking into this subject. But until looking up, researching this guy Stepness.
Yes.
And
there's a whole bunch of them. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. And yeah, I'm not surprised that all this kind of links in. It seems like a kind of sister skull and bones, basically. So that's telling. But basically, this kind of flag of convenience in Liberia started after World War II. He stops over. Now, he was also involved in Greece and all of that sort of early time, I think OSS and all of that. But he stops off in Liberia on the way back to the States. And with a guy, Ted, who was the first Liberian president that you mentioned, Ted Bus, can't see his name now.
Hold on.
But anyway, befriends this guy and basically decides that this poor underdeveloped country, Tolbert, that's the one.
Yeah.
So Liberia being rich in natural resources, but basically poor, he wanted to get American businesses to invest. He knew all of the people, big names in American corporations. And basically he wanted for them to have an easy place for them to register their ships and evade all of the oversight that came with registering under American, under the American flag or any other kind of Western flag. Basically the Standard Oil lawyers helped him draft the whole law for Liberia with Tolbert as his buddy in Liberia to create the law in Liberia that basically allowed ships to come and register there.
So now, Sullivan and Cromwell.
Exactly. Now, all of that kind of registry is run out of the United States. It is, they basically run everything stateside. Every year, the registry sends back some of the profits. I can't remember what percentage. I think it's something like 20 million a year, which is nothing if you think about it, back to the Liberian government, which accounts for something like 6% of its GDP, probably, because it's quite a small place. But this is all operated from an American business in America. And I just think it's fascinating. Consider a lot of what we discuss in Gladio Spaces. Once you start to look at how a lot of the illicit trade operates, you inevitably end up down a rabbit hole that one way or another you'll bump into shipping and world shipping and a lot of the illicit trade networks that operate that way. So anyway, I there's a lot more to this, but I think it's an interesting kind of sidebar to Liberia to understand or to know how it sort of became the world leader of flags of convenience.
That is very interesting. And no, I had not even tied those two things together. And yeah, I do see where Liberia merged with the Marshall Islands to create a joint flags of convenience corporation called International Registries, which of course is in Reston, Virginia.
That's the one. Yeah, that's the modern evolution of what that became.
Yeah. And that Charles Taylor, who was the warlord we were just talking about that overruns the rubber plantation, he signed a new contract with Liberian International Ship and Corporate Registries, which is another entity that became a source of his main revenue. It also is operated in Virginia. Yeah, that's crazy. And you're right, because once you have the monopolization of the international shipping, where you now, which, you know, now that you say that, brings all of these ships running into bridges into question as well. Wonder who flags of convenience they're flying under. But it also gives you complete control without a war of shipping. When you're shipping arms and you're shipping people and you're shipping drugs.
Yeah, 100%. And you know, there is the international law of the sea or the oceans. I can't remember, which is interesting to, I guess, put into context here. But basically, that whole, I mean, I think there's basically a kind of whole legal gray zone that operates under that you can sort of exploit by you know, running flags of convenience. You know, I mean, this is not to get all too conspiratorial, because there is obviously a very legal and rational reason that people do use them, because of, you know, legit purposes probably. But I think there's also a whole, I mean, the way it was sort of started up, I think, and there is a whole nother side of the, you know, the legal loopholes that don't allow, or that sort of allow, maybe better put, certain networks to exploit shipping in this way, right? Especially for illicit purposes.
Well, even just looking at Wikipedia, the Cambodian Shipping Corporation was one of these flags of convenience. And it says the entire thing was shut down because it was found smuggling drugs into Europe, cigarettes into Europe, breaking the Iraq oil embargo, trafficking humans and prostitution into Europe and Asia. And that finally there was so much black business and they got such a bad name. Oh, and Greek-owned ships smuggling cocaine, that they decided they'd cancel the contract. So that obviously,
it's crazy. I mean, if you think about even today's example of how all the sort of sanctions against Russia are avoided, it's, you know, it's not through crazy backflips and somersaults. It's through flags of convenience, and it's literally done as easy as that. You know, it's a system, I think, that's just used and abused so easily by you know, state and non-state actors.
And so this becomes another one of those hypocritical things, that this is exactly what they were just saying Venezuela was doing, and that it was really, really bad, in order to break the quote unquote sanctions from America, which we have no damn business even doing. And how awful Venezuela is doing it, while we're setting up entire governments via coups to do it ourselves.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Just want to make sure I was tracking. That's crazy. Carrie?
Yeah, so it's an interesting rabbit hole, but I think the story of how it sort of starts in Liberia is very interesting, and it's got the monopoly of these flags. Literally, go to any seaport, and the next time you see a big shipper or tanker, I mean, you know, it's
well, it also explains, it also explains why destabilizing Liberia was critically important in order to be able to do things like that, because you can't have a legitimate government because a legitimate government isn't going to want to be involved in that kind of shit. So that definitely explains a lot. Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up Nina Simone. She apparently became entangled with this whole thing. She moved to Liberia because she was like heavily affected by MLK's assassination. Do you know who Nina Simone is?
I know who she is. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, she got entangled in the psyop. Like, if Nina Simone was going, that was a big deal. But basically, what happened to her was she kind of lost her mind there. Like, I think they set it up as like this utopia, and then once reality hits, you're like, oh, I was wrong. And that's hard to swallow. But she became like really, she went off the cliff, man, off the cliff. And somehow she made it to France and came back up. But anyway, I just wanted to add that, how they'll use cultural figures in their psyop.
Well, that's interesting.
Thanks, Colonel, for
yeah,
everything.
Sure. Absolutely. Stellar, go ahead.
I find it quite interesting that you're talking about the tire, like Goodyear and those different companies. And then something popped in my head, and then she just talked about Nina Simone. I had no idea that she was caught up in a psyop. I loved her music. If that's the same one I'm thinking of,
It is.
The jazz.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Okay, so I had no idea, but you mentioned France. In France, you've got Michelin, who's also a tire. They have all kinds of mining and all kinds of different stuff throughout, I guess what used to be French colonies and stuff like that. And they're involved with shipping as well. So I'm just wondering, there's a whole bunch of different rabbit holes, aren't there? Because, it seems like they do things in parallel.
There's a whole bunch of rabbit holes. Yes, that is absolutely true. Yeah.
Because you got so that's when you were mentioning the different tire companies, rubber, then I was seeing like petroleum, all the different stuff. It seems like they go into these different countries, whether they're South American with a lot of resources or they go into Africa. And depending on which country during whichever time that they were doing their colonizations, then they have these companies, similar, and I mean, holy crap, that's just a whole nother rabbit hole, isn't it?
It is. And, if you look, and I mean, you could spend literally all day, every day doing this, because just if you look at Nina Simone and you then look at who talked her into going over there, it's a woman by the name of Miriam Makeba. If you go down and look at her, where did she start? She started working at Shell Oil Company. Are you fucking kidding me? Shell Oil Company is one of the biggest international syndicate players there are. And so she supposedly starts working, and she just so happens to meet and talks Nina Simone into going to Liberia. I mean, it's just again, there's rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole in all of this stuff. And it all comes back to, which is why every once in a while you have to come back to the 30,000 foot look. And after you've went down like 10 rabbit holes, zoom back out to try to make sense of, just like I was saying, it took me till I got to Liberia to realize what they were doing with the drone bases. If you go back, and now I've got to go back to the first two that I found and find out if they too killed Americans in order to get their drones armed in that country as well. Because again, you find another pattern and it makes you have to go back and look at what you've already thought that you figured out.
Yeah, because I had heard a lot of stuff about Liberia. I had no idea that these things were Operation Gladio stuff too. And I remember like in the 70s and the 80s, it seemed like there was a lot of people that were going back there, or maybe even a little bit earlier. I don't know when it became a country, When I know, like because I was brought up LDS and stuff, and I know that they used to do missions out there, and then they recalled their missions because things were getting really unstable, and it just seemed like just watching what was going on, like they pull back their missionaries, and all of a sudden, like within a year or something like that, there's issues. Same thing happened in Guyana and stuff. So it's just like, whoa, they seem to be one step ahead before like major operations start going down.
So it was a country back in the early 1800s is when we first created it to repatriate Africans. But it wasn't until like the 1980s that we began to destabilize it.
Okay, that's why then it was in the news then. Because like I said, I didn't really hear much about it until you were going to talk about it today. I'm like, that sounds really familiar. And that's probably what it's from because I'm a product of the 80s.
Yeah, exactly. Barney?
All right, Colonel, this is more like a tangent off the last the comment about international shipping. And I'm sure you probably have encountered a gigantic case that happened to be in Alan Dulles year 1, 1953, which is also the year where we see the most, some of the most flagrant MK Ultra shenanigans, such as the Frank Olson case and the Lee Harvey Oswald in the MK Ultra in New York City, meeting with the MK Ultra psychiatrist at 331 East 12th. Well, but more specifically, this case involved Saudi Arabia, right, and Aramco, and automatically you're talking Rockefellers, right? Because basically all of the initial 4 oil companies that were in Saudi Arabia forming Aramco were all Rockefeller, or formerly Rockefeller Standard Oil, right? So, like we teach the kids in high school, Standard Oil was broken up in 1913 in the antitrust case. Yet, what do you do vis-a-vis the Subaru? They're like reunited over in Saudi Arabia. And so what happens is there's this dispute between 2 Greek shipping companies. And this kind of gets back to what the other guy was talking about regarding these, the flags that they fly under and whatnot. Greece definitely is involved in international shipping. It's obviously involved in shipping before that, much earlier as well. But there was a gigantic dispute between this, Onassis, right? Onassis, who had a World War II contract with the United States, like, what do they call that? Well, he had an agreement with the U.S. Where he had a contract that enabled war shipping, and from this he built out his gigantic shipping company. And so what happened is he had gotten a gigantic sole contract with Saudi Arabia, with Aramco, for shipping their oil. Now, think about it. This is the biggest oil company on earth. It's the biggest corporation in the world, possibly right now. And to have the sole contract on the oil coming out of Nelson Rockefeller, Saudi Arabia, because that's basically what it was, right? I mean, all the Rockefeller, Saudi Arabia, Aramco. And I'll shorten this because I'm blathering on here a little bit, but what's so interesting about it is he gets in a dispute with, of all people, his brother-in-law, who's a rival Greek shipping magnate. And where it really gets down to, like, WTF, this became a gigantic court case in the United States in 1953. And it's something to really look at, because guess what? We know of the incredible overlap of people, in both CIA, your Richard Nixons, and your sundry Cubans that are between the JFK coup by the CIA and Watergate. Guess what? The whole sick crew is also involved in this 1953 case that's trying to prevent Onassis from getting the exclusive contract to ship the Saudi oil companies, and I'm sorry, to ship all of the Saudi Aramco's oil. And it's just an unbelievable overlap of players in this 1953 case that's that we see again in JFK assassination and Watergate. Incredible overlap, and it's just like, oh my God, how could, another one of them? But
Okay.
anyway, that's a little vague, but research more on that. Yeah, but the other thing also about Saudi Arabia is, you know, when those Standard Oil companies were going in, the final stage was during World War II, you know, when they used the political topsy-turvy nature of the State Department to you know, get everything they wanted. And basically, it was highly, you know, disputed. Even in the State Department of Harry Truman after the war, it's like they basically recognized that the Standard Oil, or the former Standard Oil that was now Aramco, had just gotten this amazing coup done by the U.S. taxpayer in securing this, you know, these oil concessions in Saudi Arabia. And it's like there were still some lingering New Deal type Democrats in there. They're like, what the WTF is going on here? This is an amazing ripoff of the taxpayer. I'm almost done here because I'm rambling on, but so
Okay.
basically it becomes a dispute in the Truman administration, and it's like they push it to the end, and it's all over when Eisenhower comes in, and the Dulles just give the oil companies. There's no longer a dispute, but originally it was seen as like, wow, this is a sheer giveaway, you know, a corporate rape of the public.
Right. Thanks, Barney. Strategy of tension. Go ahead. I love the name.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, I was curious if with the Operation Gladio, if you guys have talked about accelerationists at all.
To some degree, we did a space quite a while ago on the Operation Gladio cells in America. I've also done a show with Alpha Warrior on the Operation Gladio style cells in America on his show as well. So I'm familiar with it. As far as I'm concerned, what I have found, I assume you're new to our spaces.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have been doing this for almost a year. As far as book reviews that are focused on Operation Gladio, doing a lot of research. And what I have found is that if you go down to the micro level, what these entities do is they try to change names and assign labels so that people who don't know the entire network will focus in on a particular cell and never be able to zoom out and look at the macro level of how that particular cell ties into the entire operation. So if I go to a European country, you know, they had all kinds of cells in Italy and they had all kinds of cells in Belgium. They were all coordinated, but they called them separate names for plausible deniability. So if somebody got found out, it's like, oh, it's just them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I started researching strategy of tension about 4 years ago. And what I came across with Operation Gladio is it led to the accelerationists, and then it led to the U.S. side, well, the OTO and Golden Dawn, and you know, Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard started the U.S. side of the OTO, the Ordo Temple Orientis, you know, the Raleigh's thing. And then from there, L. Ron Hubbard left him after they did the Babylon workings, and he started Dianetics, and then he stopped that and went and created Scientology. Well, out of Scientology in the UK started the two people left. I can't remember the name right now. It's weird names. You might know them. And they created the Protestant Church of the Final Judgment. And then they left the UK and came inside the United States. And one of their neighbors was none other than Charlie Manson.
Right.
And the CIA mind control stuff was in the Haight district at the time. And, you know, Manson believed in a race war between races, and that's what the Protestant Church of the Final Judgment believed, and they are connected. I don't know if you've ever read the book about the sons of Sam. Trying to think of his name now. Maury Terry's book.
I've not read the book. No, I know about it, but I haven't read the book.
The son of Sam was connected to the Protestant Church of the Final Judgment,
right?
And they had their hit squads and stuff. Well, that leads to the modern day. They changed their name to various other ones. The Church of the Millennium or something like that, and then they finally became. The members became the Best Friends Animal Society, which is controlled most. It's the biggest fundraiser for them ever. I don't know if they're still connected to it or not, but they admit openly that they were part of it.
Right.
And that leads to the accelerationist groups, which is like the O9A.
Yep.
The Atomwaffen division, which Trump, by the way, took down. They took a network of them down the U.S. while he was in office.
Yep.
And that leads to the Azov battalion in the Ukraine.
Yep.
And all that. And I didn't know if you guys had made those connections or not, because there's a new version of that going around. Speaking of name changes, they're now called the Active Club. And if you go on, I'm not saying look into this stuff because there's some nasty stuff, but be warned. But if you go into Twitter and you type in Active Club, you'll see accounts pop up where they're hiding behind those and they're saying they're MMA trainers, but they're actually the same thing as the Azov Battalion, etc., the accelerations. But they're now satellite groups.
Yeah, we come up with a whole list of them. A lot of them, they go back to like Nordic. Bridget, what's the ones in the North Carolina that was building that big shelter that we found? There's a whole bunch of
the FBI funded the Atomwaffen division. I don't know if it was them or them. There's Atomwaffen division.
It may have been the Atomwaffen. Yeah.
There's a Temple of Blood.
It's along with the base.
Yeah, we put the base. Yep, that's another one. We put all of that in. I mean, I've done a thread on it a long time ago. Several months ago, when we were preparing for the show. And what you find, it tied to. We also traced it to basically what looked like Gladio stay-behind unit terrorist training camps in the northwest part of Arkansas. There's some up there that they were using for training these people in arms and the use of explosives. What I try to tell people is this is the latest iteration of what the CIA did in Miami with the Cuban exiles.
Yes.
So the Cuban exiles were used exactly the same way. And they were used not only in the JFK assassination, they were used in the assassination of the Chilean ambassador in Washington, D.C., where they put a bomb in his car. They were used in Watergate. These people in this acceleration movement and all of these others that you just articulated in a great manner of tying them all together are, and what I try to explain to people is if shit is going to happen here in the United States, these are the people they're going to use, not these migrants.
Exactly. Well, my theory, this is a theory, but you look at Patriot Front, which is, by the way, one of the new groups.
Yes.
They're tied to what is called, don't go looking on it because it's total Nazi bull crap. The Iron March is where
I've already looked. Yeah.
So you can find out who all these groups are pretty quick that way if you want to.
Yes.
And I have a theory that Antifa, Patriot Front, all of them are all funded by the same people, and it's all a show to start a race war.
Oh, absolutely.
I can't prove it, but the way these accelerationists act online with the encrypted accounts, et cetera, crooks that try to kill Trump is right to the T exactly the kind of guy that fits in those groups. But I can't prove that. I'm not saying it's legit,
Right.
but I just
No, he fits the stereotypical recruit.
Yeah, so that's all I want to say and see if you guys knew about that or not and made those connections, and I'll pass it on now.
No, I really appreciate that because I think all of us that have done the research in this area is need to all kind of coordinate the research because this is so big and most people have no idea it exists. But
can I say? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just want to say one last thing that I didn't talk about is Charlottesville.
Yep.
You know, the people carrying the tiki torches, the torches.
Yep.
That was Identity Europa, which is part of this stuff.
Yep.
And they were the ones that started that stuff with Antifa in Charlottesville. And the driver of the car that, you can look this up, the driver of the car that rammed the cars and killed the girl, the lady, was a member of one of those groups.
Correct.
So that's all. Thank you.
So I think, and I'm going to say this again because I say it every opportunity, and thank you for queuing it up. When people say that, oh my gosh, all of these military age men coming across the border, this is what the CIA is setting up. They are going to blame these people after having just let them all in, irony of all ironies, but it isn't going to be them. It is going to be someone, because what we have found in at studying all of these coups all over the world and all of these events that begin the orchestration of the coup, the unrest, the people out in the streets and all of that stuff, they leave nothing to chance. Everything is practiced, everything is rehearsed, and the entire plan is orchestrated. It would be much more difficult to do that unless these people have been trained in other areas and then brought across the border. And what I have said in those cases, the CIA brought Reinhard Gehlen into the United States, plopped him down in Washington, D.C., and debriefed him to create the stay-behind units all over Europe. They damn sure don't have to bring a bunch of people across a river in southern U.S. in order to get these people here to orchestrate a coup or the overthrow of our government or chaos, like Operation Northwood style chaos. They are going to, if they use internationalists, they will fly them in and they will fly them back out. They have complete control of that. So,
okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, one last thing. I promise this is the last thing.
You don't have to say it's the last thing.
I don't want to hog the mic. So January 6th was also coordinated by Nancy Pelosi. Now we've seen the video. She proved that,
right,
she did not have the National Guard there for a reason. If you look up January 6th photos, they got the siege masks on all over the place, and mixed in the crowd is members of these groups. So January 6th was one of those orchestrated attacks. It was basically
100%. 100%. So we tracked one of the guys that was actually trained in Ukraine. He was flown into the United States and flown back out of the San Francisco airport, and the FBI actually stopped him. Alpha is a warrior who I do a show with on a weekly basis, is the one that brought him to our attention. He was in DC in pictures, and he was actually trained by the Azov battalion, and he was flown back out of the US from the San Francisco after being interviewed by the FBI, put back on an airplane and allowed to leave while they're rounding up Americans and sticking them in jail. So yeah, all part of the same organization, 100%. So let's see.
And can I throw one thing in there?
Sure.
And it sure seems like exactly to the letter what is going on right now over in Europe. that we've been seeing so many videos?
Well, I would say it's what's happening in Venezuela as well.
The same black mask, the same black clothes.
Yep.
They don't even change anything.
Right.
They don't change it because it's worked in the past.
Right.
Well, we'll look at the UK riots right now. I mean, for me, one of the main tell points of accelerationism, and I think it's worth making the distinction between the sort of theoretical side, because you look it up, you'll get a bunch of academic work that talks about accelerationism. But it really is fifth generation warfare. And I think that's how it's important to sort of distinguish it, not by a kind of an ideology, right? Because you have all these fronts, and it could be neo-Nazis, Antifas, even the radical eco, zero carbon people.
Right.
Where, all of these fronts are basically the same sort of
strategy of tension. It's right.
And strategy of tension,
yes.
exactly.
Yes.
I want to point it back straight to the speaker, because
yes.
it totally is about strategy of tension.
It absolutely is.
And a tactic. And the more you kind of understand that, I think the more it kind of fits into the wider picture that Towner's been really, Colonel, you've been really bringing to the front here in a lot of your spaces. So for me, maybe just the last bit, I'd like to shout out, there's Jade Parker is probably I kind of see as a whistleblower in that sort of space. She's been talked about in other Twitter spaces, but she is a cyber intelligence or counterterrorism researcher who was involved in really looking how fifth generation warfare was being used in the radical Islamic sort of space and world of sort of counterterrorism in that thing, and she has a huge amount of insight to, I think, give, and wrote a lot about it, and I think uncovered maybe a little bit too much above her pay grade when she was doing this work, and was one of the first to point out of how these very same tactics were being used in the sort of quote-unquote alt-right, neo-Nazi space, and a lot of the online grooming forums that we're seeing in the much more sort of vile, disgusting, and horrible shit like O9A and stuff like that. So look her up. She's done a few of interesting podcasts, but has sort of disappeared from the map, I think, alarmingly. I hope she's still out there doing whatever she does, because she seems to be on the good side of a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, we found several of her videos and watched them early on in this process. But
so interesting.
Zama, yeah. I do want to say one thing, though. One of the things, as we have said repeatedly, and it bears repeating often, is words matter. And I do believe that they create different labels in their strategy of tension, pitting things against each other to try to sideline us from seeing them as a whole. And that's the reason why I know that they have assigned labels to them, like the acceleration, but I tend not to ever use those labels, because I talk mainly about the concept of Operation Gladio, and I stay focused generally on the strategic implications of it happening worldwide. And it's important, though, to call out and let people know what they are. And that's why I'm very hesitant when someone comes in, and you cued me in on it when you talk about the academic definition of it, because once you get to the point where you've got and keep in mind, the CIA pays the academics to do it. We need to understand that. The CIA is paying the academics to define words for us, to create the borders of what we are the terms that we are supposed to use. And when they do that, then you get down in the weeds and you lose the big picture. So I just say that with a caution.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for pointing that out. I think that's so essential. And especially as you say, it's part of the generational warfare is very much media and psychological warfare, and it's about framing the narrative.
Correct.
It's very much about putting the definitional sort of terms in place so that it's only talked about within certain frames and contexts.
Correct.
I agree with that completely. I just want to put a warning out there since I brought up 09 A&M. Please don't go looking into this stuff very deep. Stay to like names, connections, or like that kind of stuff, because there's some stuff you don't want to find. I just want to throw that out there because these people are nihilists. That's what they really are, and they believe they have no morals. So I mean, I just want to throw that out there as a warning. So I don't want people going looking at some of this stuff and then they end up with child porn on their computer.
They are definitely Satanists of the most evil imaginations that you can want to even know exist. And quite frankly, if you go back, since you brought up the whole Manson connection, if you go back in the whole killing of Sharon Tate, and the gruesome, if you know anything about what happened in Laurel Canyon, which we went all over during a couple of our very early podcasts, we probably ought to revisit that again, Bridget. But the whole Laurel Canyon scene, the music scene that was set up in the 60s as they to deride the war protests, the legitimate ones that were happening, and to discredit them by the CIA. They basically created the entire Los Angeles music industry at that point. And they used CIA kids and senior military kids to create those bands out there. Frank Zappa, all of those guys were all intelligence children that were sent out there as young adults to create this quote unquote movie scene that is tied into all of this. Go ahead.
Sorry, I completely agree. Mamas and papas.
Yes, every bit of it.
The Rolling Stones. Listen to Paint It Black again. Listen to the lyrics. That tells you everything you need to know. And there's a multiple other bands, but I agree. Well, the Beach Boys, Manson wrote.
Yep.
Go look at Guns N' Roses. Look at the Beach Boys. Look at various other authors. System of a Down.
Wasn't Jim Morrison's dad one of the?
Jim Morrison. He's an admiral. He was in charge of the false flag. Yeah, he was in charge of the false flag in Vietnam that got us into that. Yeah.
And so all of it, like, it's all been fed to us through media.
Yes.
And entertainment.
Yes. So that's why I think it's good to make those connections and use from an identification point, label the ones in case you run across them so that you know they fit into that bucket. But I just encourage people to stay at the more strategic level, because that's where they get defeated at. We're going to defeat them by being able to call out their bullshit, like in Venezuela right now, and in the attempted assassination of Slovakia. What's happening in Bangladesh? We'll go into that when we get to Asia. But what's happening right now, where they just ran the prime minister out of Bangladesh? Same thing. I did not know until I was asked to do a show, which we've not done yet, on Bangladesh, that Bangladesh actually used to be called East Pakistan. And I'm embarrassed to say that, having been a military officer for so long. But our education system sucks. And when you start doing the research on it just blows your mind. And I'm trying to put together something right now that'll dive a little bit deeper into Pakistan, because Pakistan, as you've heard me say many times, is a made-up country. But until you go back and you look at some of the ways in which it was made up, do you find out just how intimately involved in Pakistan's creation the MI6 and the UK government was. So you basically have a vassal state of a combination primarily of the UK, but of the US as well. And then you look at the intricate role that it played with the ISI and us giving them the most money the CIA's ever given to anybody to create the war and entice the USSR into a war with a false flag into Afghanistan. We overthrew the king of Afghanistan. We overthrew several governments in Afghanistan, and just on and on. We've assassinated the good person that was elected in Pakistan in order to try to right the ship there. So we couped that government as well. And so, again, you just look around the world and you can see these things playing out, and you can then trace, because remember, we traced the Tajikistan guys and the creation of that country into the Chechnya war with Russia to destabilize Russia. Those same guys were used in the Ukraine attempted, well, not attempted, actually murder of 147 people. Those were all Tajikistan Gladio operators trained in Turkey, which, remember, Turkey has the biggest gray wolf population of Operation Gladio trained killers. Maybe less now since Erdogan has started taking them out, but probably a close second at this point is Colombia, because they have Rena assassins down there. But anyway, yeah, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
I mean, another example real quick is Iran. Look at photos. You want to prove this to somebody? Show them photos of Iran before the revolution, and it looks like America.
Iran
They're
is
wearing,
yeah.
It doesn't look anything like you think it would look like.
Yeah, we destroyed Iran by the cooing of Mossadegh way back in the day. There's just so much. Fed up? Go ahead.
Yeah, it was interesting when you brought up a lot of these people in the entertainment, but especially Morrison, because I was actually just watching, and I can't remember who it was he was talking to. Just happened to, like 2 days ago, Alex Jones was interviewing somebody, and they were talking about all these different celebrities that supposedly, have disappeared and, may have faked their death. And he said that out of all of them, the only one that he believed actually did fake his death was Morrison. And it was because of his dad. He said he's seen several sources over the years that his dad warned him that they were going to take him out because he was talking out against a lot of things and different things like that. And the way his death was handled overseas,
it's very weird. Yeah, Club of 27.
Well, and his dad was a rear admiral in the Navy. He was very high up. Was involved in some of the really dirty stuff. I mean, his dad was one of the leads involved in Tonkin, that got us really into Vietnam. So
yeah. He
pretty,
definitely was part of the Gladio people, read in on that, just as McCain's dad was as well.
Yep. And when you figure some of that out, these connections some of these guys have, the whole way back to, I mean, his dad was at Pearl Harbor.
Yep.
So, I mean,
it's a small world after all. I get that tune in my head at least once a day.
Well, I get it all the time too, because y'all mentioned, my wife and I joke all the time. We're from North Carolina, and it seems like every time something comes up, it's like, does everything connect through North Carolina? And then I always have to remember, it's like, oh yeah, military PSYOPs headquarters is right down at Bragg.
Exactly. So just about every one of our stories connects to North Carolina.
That or the stuff that's been run through Chapel Hill, which we've seen, of course, a lot of that over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
On the entertainment side, follow Marianne Faithfull, and you'll find a lot of connections there.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's see. I don't know what your name is. Martin Bott. I'm gonna go with that. What you got?
from Germany.
Hello.
I think you have a lot of, and that's Germany is messing up a lot with the United States. You have a lot of military personnel here in Germany being sent by the US, and Germany is trying.
You're banding really bad. I'm trying to get, we're only getting like every other word. We're only.
I get. Yeah, I'm driving through the woods over the border of France right now. So, well, you always have to look for the German link. And then you get a lot of more understanding of what is happening. I don't know whether you know that in 2020 they stormed the Reichstag in Berlin. Right? So you can look it up on the internet, on YouTube. They made a sort of exercise to test how this goes. And then they made the storming in the United States also of the I don't know what, right? So the Germans tried it before here in Berlin.
Okay. I'm not sure I got all of that, but.
Yeah, look up, search at YouTube, Sturm auf den Reichstag, storming the Reichstag.
Oh, okay.
And Storm of the Reichstag? Is that what you're?
Yep.
I gotcha. We were just trying to get the words you were saying. Yes.
And they didn't get into the building. They just stopped in front of it because they didn't want to destroy anything. It was just an exercise. Right? They withdrew the police right before, and then only 5 policemen were standing in front of the Reichstag. It was obviously just trying how to manage such an operation.
Oh, so you think that was like a dry run?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what they told us in the German army when I was in the German army for my 15 months in 87, 86. They told us the Reichswehr, during the Nazi time, they built up mock cities or mock forts and so on, and tried to storm a bunker, pillbox, and so on.
So I guess you probably are very much aware of the fact that as Erdogan has cut down or cracked down on their Grey Wolf Gladio operators, that a significant amount of them are moving into Germany from Turkey.
So I don't have so much information, but I'm sitting in the middle of the problem, right? I can see all the details, how the Germans think, how the Germans react, and so that I've got the thinking of these guys, and I learned it the hard way because I was never part of the system.
Yeah, they're definitely all over Germany now.
It would be hard if you were in the eye of the storm to see.
Yeah, I'm right now. I'm leaving Germany now overnight because I go to France and to sleep there overnight in my car to escape being tortured by the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the ex-Gestapo.
That's crazy.
Yeah, Germany.
Yeah, it's hard to believe we're living through that right now.
Yeah, and I'm doing this for 10 years by now. Almost every night for 10 years. That's 50 kilometers to Lauterburg. It's called. It's near Karlsruhe, right on the eastern point of France, northeast of where the Rhine leaves France. That's Lauterburg, and there I will be sleeping in front of the church or in front of the gendarmerie. I don't know. I'm not.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Molly, did you have a question?
Oh, my heart goes out to that man.
Right.
Please know our hearts are with you, and we are not as insane as the people you see on the news.
I know, and I always hear the lies about the U.S. Right? The U.S. is Germany is occupied and all this shit. right? The US tried to get into contact with us, with my family, my brother and me, in 30 years ago. And in Ettling, where we live, there was a barracks with 2,000 US soldiers, and probably the families included. And they didn't send a soldier there or a bunch of soldiers to ask my brother or something, like he was there every weekend in Ettling. They didn't ask him, they didn't send anyone. But they contacted him in Spain with 3 Americans who were traveling through Europe. And then they came passing by and visited us. So I picked them up at the train station in Karlsruhe, and I was almost attacked by obviously snitches of I don't know, Secret Service or something, Bundesnachrichtendienst, and they threatened me and shouted around and so on. There was about 5 guys from the German military police standing there. They didn't react, the police didn't react, and so on. So they showed the Americans, when you try to contact the opposition in Germany, they'll get crushed, and it's your fault. That was the news, the information the Americans had that was brought to the Americans. Right? And every day I hear the lies of the Germans, of the German snitches, about the US, about Russia, about China, and so on. And when you know the truth and have lived through it, it's unbelievable what the Germans have in power, how much power they have today after losing 2 world wars. And now they're back again since the 1980s. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, one of the things that the Colonel says often is that World War II did not end. It was, there was no defeat. It just changed.
Yeah, exactly. Like this, I don't know, a German officer said in Spa, that's in Belgium, when they signed the peace treaty in 1919, he said, au revoir in 20 years. So we'll be back in 20 years. And if you count from 1990 to 1939, that's 20 years. The Germans knew in 1990 they will be back in 20 years when the next generation is prepared to fight. And they openly spoke about it.
Yeah, we've also covered the Madrid Circular that was written at a conference there by a lot of Germans that they're not Germans, Nazis that had been ratlined through Spain onto Argentina and South America. They were at a conference in Madrid, Spain, where Otto Skorzeny had taken up residence and wrote a document called the Madrid Circular that basically articulates Operation Gladio, the strategy of tension, and how they were going to basically install fascist dictators all around the world, and they were going to do it using NATO. And all of this stuff is coordinated out of NATO headquarters. All of the Operation Gladio strategy of tension comes out of NATO. NATO is the world's largest terrorist organization.
It's German, led by Germany. If you look from the sky onto the headquarters, it's SS.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The first 16 years it had. Yeah.
The same is true for the Bundesnachrichtendienst in Pullach near Munich. They have a swastika style, not the swastika, but the under masonry under the swastika in a certain way, right? More stone in a certain pattern, and then they put the swastika on top. There are 3 buildings. Pullach, they also have a pattern. Even in our church, they have a pattern in Catholic church in Pfaffenrod.
Okay.
Church was built in 1949.
Martin, we're losing you again.
Yeah.
And it's past 6.
Can
We're
I go ahead and make my comment?
Sure, Molly. I didn't know you still needed to make your comment. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I was just being patient and listening to him. But I wanted to tell you, Colonel, it is very, very helpful when you bring us back to using correct terms, and when you talk about your 30,000 foot point of view, you talk about, the cattle truck and the cattle prods on both sides of us. A lot of times in the church, we talk about, the narrow path, and there's ditches on both sides of the road.
Yeah.
They dig these pitfalls along both sides of the road, whether you think you're left or right. They dig these pits with juicy bits of information for you to fall into that pit and get stuck there for a few years.
Yep.
But you are doing an excellent job of helping people stay above all that and kind of looking at each pitfall as you go by, but staying on the road. So you do an excellent job when you do that.
Thank you, Molly. And I think it's so important for us to go back and actually learn real history, since we've all been deprived of what the actual real history is. I also think it's very important to put that history in context of the modern day thing, which basically the strategy of tension, I think he's gone now, actually brings us back. You have to stay put in both camps. And we have to stay cognizant of how what we're learning applies to today, but keep going back and understanding the patterns so that we can accurately interpret what is happening today. And I just think that's so important. Fed Up, I am sorry. I have got to run. I'm on grandma duty in about 10 minutes. So if it's quick, go ahead. But otherwise, we're going to close out. You'll take us home.
It's super quick. I was just letting everybody know, for a little levity in the bubble, I put Norm Macdonald's stand up of Germany versus the world. So if you need a little laugh and levity since Germany came up, that's it.
Thank you for doing that. I'll have to go check that out when I get over to my daughter's house. That ought to be funny. So thanks for adding that. That's a good note to close on anyway. That gives us all a smile. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Appreciate it. And we'll be back tomorrow. And tomorrow night is the Alpha Warrior show as well. So that'll start around 9:30 tomorrow night. So if you want to put that on your calendars. Thanks again, everybody, for being here. Thanks, everybody, for being on the Rumble channel today. Appreciate it. See you guys tomorrow.